What if I told you that a simple green piece of paper holds more power than armies, weapons, or even presidents? Not because it's backed by gold. Not because it's physically imposing. But because it's trusted, feared, and relentlessly pursued. This is the story of the US dollar, a currency born in revolution, forged through war, and elevated by global ambition. It doesn't march, it doesn't fire missiles, and yet, it conquers. From oil fields in the Middle East to lithium mines in South America, from the skyscrapers of Wall Street to the shadowy corridors of offshore finance, the dollar is everywhere. It dictates who trades, who lends, who survives. It's the silent architect behind sanctions, bailouts, and collapses. A tool of diplomacy. A weapon of control. A symbol of stability, and of dependence. But how did a piece of paper become the world's most powerful currency? And what happens when that power begins to crack? This is not just a story about money. It's a story about influence, vulnerability, and the invisible empire that shapes our lives. Welcome to the dollar's dominion.
The dollar was born in 1792, in a nation still finding its footing. The United States had just emerged from revolution, bruised, indebted, and fragmented. Its economy was a patchwork of colonial currencies, foreign coins, and barter systems. There was no standard, no trust, no unity, so Congress passed the Coinage Act, establishing the U.S. Mint and authorizing a new currency, the dollar. It was modeled after the Spanish silver dollar, widely circulated in the Americas, and pegged to a bimetallic standard, gold and silver. But in truth, it was just one more coin in a crowded global marketplace. The British pound reigned across empires. The French franc carried the weight of Enlightenment Europe. Spanish silver flowed through colonial trade routes. The dollar was provincial, young, untested, and geographically confined. For decades, it remained a domestic tool, used mostly within U.S. borders. Its value fluctuated. Its reach was limited. It wasn't until the Civil War that paper dollars, greenbacks, entered the scene, issued to fund the Union's war effort. But even then, confidence was shaky. People preferred gold. Banks hoarded silver. The dollar was still a promise, not yet a power. So how did it rise from obscurity to global dominance? The answer lies not just in economics, but in geopolitics, war, and trust. The dollar's ascent would be shaped by global crises, strategic decisions, and the slow erosion of its rivals. It would take 2 world wars, a Great Depression, and a new kind of empire, one built not on territory, but on finance. The dollar didn't conquer the world overnight. It crept in, quietly, strategically, until one day, it wasn't just America's currency. It was the world's. The turning point came not in a bank, nor on a battlefield, but in a quiet mountain town in New Hampshire. It was 1944. World War II was still raging, but the Allies were already looking beyond the smoke and rubble. They knew that victory would mean nothing without economic stability. The Great Depression had shattered trust in global finance. Currencies had collapsed, trade had fractured, and the world was desperate for a new foundation. So, 730 delegates from 44 nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods. Their mission? To rebuild the global economy and prevent another financial catastrophe. But behind the speeches and handshakes, a quiet power shift was underway. Britain, once the financial center of the world, was drowning in war debt. France was weakened. Germany and Japan were devastated. Only one nation stood strong, economically, militarily, and industrially, the United States. And with that strength came leverage. The delegates agreed to a radical new system. Every major currency would be pegged to the US dollar, and the dollar itself would be tied to gold, at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. This made the dollar, quite literally, as good as gold. It became the anchor of global finance, a stable reference point in a chaotic world. But it was more than just a technical fix. It was a geopolitical statement. The dollar wasn't just a currency anymore. It was a symbol of post-war order, American leadership, and global trust. From that moment on, international trade, investment, and reserves would orbit around the dollar. It would become the default language of global finance. And the U.S., through its currency, would quietly shape the rules of the New World economy. Bretton Woods wasn't just a conference. It was the birth of a financial empire. In August 1971, the world watched as a single televised announcement shattered the foundation of global finance. President Richard Nixon, facing inflation, trade deficits, and mounting pressure from foreign governments demanding gold for their dollars, made a bold and controversial move. He suspended the dollar's convertibility into gold. Just like that, the promise made at Bretton Woods, that every dollar was backed by a fixed amount of gold, was broken. It was called the Nixon Shock, and it sent tremors through the global economy. Without gold, the dollar became a fiat currency, backed not by metal, but by trust. Many feared chaos. Would nations abandon the dollar? Would inflation spiral out of control? Would the financial system collapse? But something unexpected happened. Instead of weakening, the dollar began to evolve. Freed from the constraints of gold, the U.S. could print money, manage interest rates, and respond to crises with unprecedented flexibility. The Federal Reserve gained new power. Markets became more dynamic and more volatile, and the world, despite its doubts, kept using the dollar. Why? Because there was no alternative. The U.S. economy was still the largest, its financial markets the deepest, its military the most powerful. And crucially, global trade, especially oil, remained priced in dollars. This wasn't just a shift in monetary policy. It was a transformation of global power. The dollar was no longer as good as gold. It was something more elusive and more dominant. A currency backed by confidence, by influence, by the sheer weight of American presence in the world. The Nixon Shock didn't end the dollar's reign. It redefined it. From that moment on, the dollar wasn't just a measure of value. It was a tool of strategy, a lever of diplomacy, and a symbol of a new kind of empire, one built not on metal, but on belief. The dollar's dominance didn't just survive the end of the gold standard. It found a new anchor: oil. In the early 1970s, as the global economy reeled from inflation and uncertainty, the United States made a quiet but monumental deal with Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil exporter. The agreement was simple, but profound. Saudi oil would be priced exclusively in U.S. dollars. In return, the U.S. would provide military protection, arms, and political support. Other OPEC nations followed suit. And just like that, the petrodollar system was born. Oil, the lifeblood of the modern world, could now only be purchased with dollars. Whether you were Japan importing crude, Germany fueling its industries, or Argentina powering its cities, you needed dollars. This forced every country to hold large reserves of U.S. currency. Central banks stocked up, global trade revolved around it, and demand for dollars soared. It was a masterstroke of financial diplomacy. The U.S. didn't need to force its currency on the world. It simply made it indispensable. And with that demand came power. The dollar became not just a medium of exchange, but a gatekeeper. It allowed the U.S. to run persistent trade deficits without collapsing its currency. It gave Washington leverage over allies and adversaries alike, and it turned American financial institutions into global arbiters. But the petrodollar system was more than economics. It was a geopolitical pact, a fusion of energy, finance, and military influence. The dollar was no longer backed by gold. It was backed by oil, by trust, and by the implicit promise of American might. From Tokyo to Berlin to Buenos Aires, the dollar became the world's ticket to energy. And in a world addicted to oil, that ticket was non-negotiable. Today, the US dollar is more than a currency. It's the bloodstream of the global economy. Roughly 60% of all global foreign exchange reserves are held in dollars. That means central banks from Beijing to Brasilia rely on it to stabilize their economies. It's the default reserve, the fallback when things go wrong. Most international trade, from coffee beans in Colombia to aircraft parts in Germany, is priced in dollars. Even deals between countries that don't involve the US often settle in dollars. It's the language of commerce, the unit of trust. And in times of crisis, whether it's a pandemic, a war, or a financial meltdown, investors flee to the dollar like a lifeboat. Its liquidity, its scale, and its perceived safety make it the ultimate safe haven. But the dollar's power goes far beyond economics. It's a strategic weapon, wielded not with tanks, but with transactions. Because the global financial system runs through US-controlled infrastructure, from SWIFT messaging to dollar-clearing banks, Washington can cut off entire nations with a single decision. Just ask Iran, whose economy was strangled by sanctions, or Russia, which was severed from key financial channels after its invasion of Ukraine, or Venezuela, where access to global markets was frozen. These aren't just penalties, they're financial blockades. And they work because the dollar is everywhere. This power gives the US enormous leverage in diplomacy, conflict, and global governance. It can reward allies, punish adversaries, and shape behavior, all without firing a shot. But it also breeds resentment. Some nations are now seeking alternatives, building regional currencies, exploring digital systems, and trading in yuan or euros. Yet none have matched the dollar's reach, depth, or trust. For now, the dollar still rules. Not because it's perfect, but because it's entrenched. It's the currency of last resort, the tool of first response, and the quiet force behind global order. But is the dollar's empire eternal? The cracks are subtle, but growing. China is pushing the yuan as a global alternative, striking bilateral trade deals that bypass the dollar entirely. Its Belt and Road Initiative isn't just about infrastructure. It's about influence, currency, and reshaping global norms. Cryptocurrencies offer another path, decentralized, borderless, and untethered from any government. Bitcoin, Ethereum, and emerging digital assets challenge the very idea of centralized monetary control. They promise freedom, but also volatility, fragmentation, and regulatory chaos. And then there's the US itself. Its national debt keeps climbing, past $34 trillion and counting. Political gridlock, fiscal deficits, and rising interest payments raise questions about long-term stability. Can a currency remain dominant if its issuer seems increasingly unstable? Some nations are hedging their bets, diversifying reserves, building regional payment systems, and experimenting with central bank digital currencies. The dollar's grip is no longer absolute. Yet despite all this, the dollar remains king. Not because it's flawless, not because it's invincible, but because the world hasn't found a better replacement. Its infrastructure is vast, its liquidity is unmatched, its trust, though tested, still runs deeper than its rivals. The dollar's future may not be guaranteed, but for now, it remains the axis around which global finance spins. And until something stronger, safer, and more universal emerges, the dollar's reign continues. So next time you hold a dollar bill, take a moment, look past the ink, the symbols, the signatures. It's not just paper, it's a passport to global trade, a silent witness to wars, treaties, and revolutions, a tool of diplomacy, a lever of control. That small green rectangle has shaped economies, toppled regimes, and built empires. Without ever firing a shot, it's the currency that fuels oil tankers, stock markets, and humanitarian aid. It's the lifeline for nations in crisis, and the weapon in sanctions that isolate entire economies. It whispers through every transaction, every loan, every deal made in boardrooms and backchannels. The dollar is not just money, it's infrastructure, it's influence, it's the quiet empire that runs the global economy. And whether we realize it or not, we're all living in its shadow.